Hey everyone, it's great to see some familiar faces and some new faces. Welcome to the World Headquarters and Power Center of the Endangered Alphabets Project. Those of you who have seen my previous Zooms are used to me getting up and walking around and showing things such as the carvings on the walls here and also my rabbit. And today we're going to try and do something extraordinarily radical, which is to be more focused and organized and somewhat less rambling, which of course could be a complete disaster. So I actually have a script and a clear sense of purpose and points that I want to make. And we'll see how it goes. We're gonna wait just about 2 more minutes and then get rolling. As most of you, because I recognize many of your names, most of you know the carvings that you see are mine. And the one right here, of course, is in Cherokee. It is Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the Cherokee script. That's the subject of today's talk, and I'll explain why it is I've chosen to begin with that. As usual, if you have questions that you want to put into chat, that'd be great. And as usual, magician and guru Alec Julian is running the board and doing the production. So he's gonna be in charge of that. And then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. And the music, in which we've already had one compliment for, was composed by Patricia Julian, specifically for the Endangered Alphabets. And bless her for even having a conception of what Endangered Alphabets music would sound like. Okay, so as usual, by registering for this talk, we now have your email, which means that after the talk is over, I'm going to email you with the link to the next talk, and also the link to the recording, which is going to go up on our YouTube channel, because Alec knows how to do that kind of thing. Okay, so let's get going. So I've chosen to start this series of talks with the Cherokee syllabary and with Sequoia, because his invention of the script raises some really interesting questions about what writing is and what it is not, and what it could be, especially in ways in which we don't usually think about writing. It also raises some grimmer questions about how writing systems become endangered. So Sequoia is remarkable, not least in that he's the one linguist that most people, or that some people at any rate, have heard of. So he was the Cherokee who, between about 1810 and 1821, taught himself to read and write in the process of creating a writing system for his people. He's the first person in history whom we know of who made that extraordinary transition and that contribution. So this achievement was so unexpected and so powerful that Sequoia's portrait hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. He went there and apparently posed for the portrait, obviously demonstrating his syllabary there. Not only that, but his statue stands in the National Statuary Hall. And he's the only linguist I know of who had a tree named after him, the sequoia. So what I want to ask today, though, is what exactly was his achievement? What can we learn from it? And not only what can we learn from it about the Cherokee script, but what can we learn from it about writing? Many of the talks in this series are going to be less about the specifics of the script at hand, and actually more about writing in general and what we can learn by looking at that script. So a standard narrative of Sequoia's achievement is that Native Americans were illiterate and they saw writing as a kind of witchcraft, but Sequoia's genius enabled him to rise above all of that and to think like a European. I'm going to challenge that. So a Cherokee newspaper, the Cherokee Phoenix, came out, which was printed in both English and Cherokee. And it was read as far away as London. And I've read a couple of copies of the Cherokee Phoenix, actually in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, which is the home of the headquarters of the Cherokee Nation. And much of the news in the Cherokee Phoenix really kind of boils down to the simple fact that the Cherokee script, this homegrown, indigenously created script, actually exists and that it works. The newspaper itself is a demonstration of the fact that it's there and it works. In short, the newspaper supported a sort of a well-intentioned liberal position that went, see, the red man can be educated. He is not a savage after all. He can even invent his own alphabet, although technically Cherokee is in fact a syllabary. So hidden under that assumption or that position are some rather nasty little secrets of linguistics and anthropology. And those are really what I want to bring up and talk about today. So not long after Sequoia died, a Brit and an American, a linguist and an anthropologist, and in some respects the founders of those disciplines, wrote some sort of seminal texts that that really open up the assumptions hidden underneath the reactions to Sequoia's achievement. And we've got a slide here we're going to look at. So in Ancient Society, published in 1877, Lewis Henry Morgan argued that writing, especially the written alphabet, was the sole innovation that marked the passage of humankind from what he called the upper status of barbarism to the final and consummate status of civilization. He certainly wasn't the only person to equate writing with civilization, or even the creation of writing with the birth of civilization. But the timing of this is very important. And the fact that he saw this transition or this passage as being really important is significant. At roughly the same time, this general passage was broken down into linguistic stages by one of the earliest and most influential cultural anthropologists, who argued that as a culture evolved, its writing system evolved. Morgan's contemporary, Edward Burnett Tyler, in Researches into the Early History of Mankind and the Development of Civilization, 1865, proposed that writing progressed from ideograms, and by that he means both pictograms and ideograms, through to verbal, syllabic, and finally alphabetic symbols. Each step denoting the intellectual and social progress of that society toward presumably a colonial Victorian ideal. So pictographs, which were found throughout the Americas, therefore, by this logic, were primitive and barbaric, sort of picture writing. They were kind of a sign that the natives didn't know any better. So real writing, evolved alphabetic writing, consisted of abstract symbols that didn't look like anything, and they represented sounds. And a lot of people still think like that. So there are three huge holes in that argument, quite apart from the fact that it's a racist argument. So first of all, that argument assumes that if humans do intellectually evolve like this, then everything old must be primitive and inferior. But clearly that isn't the case. Can we have the cave paintings slide? Okay, so if you look at the cave paintings found at, by Chauvet and at Altamira, and you realize they are 30,000 years old. It's amazing how the reaction when those paintings were discovered was they cannot possibly be that old. And the assumption is they had smaller brains back then. You know, if we are really the pinnacle of evolution, then if we go back 30,000 years, then presumably people were just kind of grunting and hitting each other with sticks. So this whole notion of evolution then is actually a form of self-congratulation. It sort of assumes that everything led up to us and we are the best that could be. So the second hole in the Morgan-Tyler argument is that it assumes that picture writing is childish and easy, and alphabetic writing is sophisticated and adult. Whereas in fact, Mayan glyphs, like the ones that you see here, are extraordinarily beautiful and complex. Not only that, but the idea of conveying meaning by using pictures is actually a really challenging idea. Alphabetic writing, in other words, you know, the representation of sounds by symbols, alphabetic writing works, in fact, because it requires less skill. So I personally cannot draw an I, but I can write an I. What this means is that it's not that we have evolved and that the forms of writing have evolved to their present state. It means that in our efforts to convey meaning, we've just discovered a workaround by focusing not on ideas, but on individual sounds. And the fact is that pictograms and ideograms actually encode certain kinds of meaning extremely well. And if they didn't, we wouldn't have emoji or universal traffic signs. So the third hole in this evolution argument is that if we just look around the world today, we see how wrong Morgan and Tyler were. So Chinese writing, for example, is not alphabetic. Therefore, by their argument, it should be primitive. And the beautiful flowing Brahmi-derived scripts of Southeast Asia. So this is actually from Bali. This is Balinese writing. Those are not true alphabets, either in the strictest sense of the word. So again, they ought to be somehow inferior. So what we have hidden then is what was Sequoia's true achievement. And I'm going to argue that it wasn't that his achievement was to act like a European and to be able to create a script that looked somewhat like a European script. That in fact, his achievement was to, pause here because I need to look at my script. I hate working from a script. Hang on a second. Right. Okay. What Sequoia's achievement goes to demonstrate is something that I'm going to come back to time and again through this series of talks, which is history is not only written by the winners, it's written in the alphabet of the winners. We think of our form of writing as being evolved and therefore superior. But the fact is that the Latin alphabet has become the default alphabet of our times, because at crucial points in history, that was the alphabet that came with the most lawyers, guns, and money. It's the alphabet of conquistadors. It's the alphabet of Victorian imperialists. And we have convinced ourselves, therefore, that that was what was bound to happen, and everything was bound to lead up to this particular form. So what it comes down to then is writing an expression of meaning, or is it an expression of speech? So Sequoia's amazing achievement, I'm going to argue, was to reconceive the purpose of symbolic communication from sign to speech, and to grasp in about 10 or 15 years, this is what he did, a way of thinking that had taken the so-called civilized world about 4,000 years to develop. So he went from his cultural background, which is thinking in terms of representation, pictorial representation of ideas, even remarkable things like trees that were coerced into growing in certain shapes, which conveyed messages to people walking along paths and trails, and saw that particular tree, knew that it had meaning. So this was Sequoia's background, and in about 10 or 15 years, he grasped, wait a second, let's think about communication in an entirely different way, and let's focus on units of sound, which I find it very hard to believe that any Cherokee had done before, and to create symbols for units of sound. Not only that, but to analyze the sound, to systematize his symbols, to demonstrate that they worked to a very skeptical tribal council, and then to teach them. So to me, that is Sequoia's true genius. And so then what happened to his script? Within the Cherokee people, it was extraordinarily successful. The tribal council realized that this was something that was enormously valuable, and immediately ordered that young men and boys at first, and then subsequently girls and women, should learn the script. The Cherokee became literate probably more quickly than any other people in history. And there's evidence that there are areas where the literacy rate amongst Cherokee was higher than it was among white settlers in the same area. So in that sense, not only was it enormously successful as an intellectual achievement, it showed a collective success in the Cherokee recognition of how valuable it could be, and picking up the entire set of skills involved in literacy. So that is also an extraordinary thing. But what Sequoia had done in creating this script was also to threaten those very settlers. Can we have the next slide? It's really interesting that when the Indian Removal Act of 1830 made it legal for Indian nations to be forcibly removed from their homelands and resettled further west, the Cherokee syllabary was specifically targeted. So here's a quote from A History of Georgia. And this is what the notoriously brutal Georgia Guard, who had the responsibility for keeping the Cherokee people in check, so to speak. This is what the Guard did. They went to the offices of the Cherokee Phoenix, where the printing press was, and they broke the place open and, quote, they dumped the soft lead type, which had been made out of the linings of tea chests by the Reverend Samuel Worcester, also an amazing achievement. They dumped the type on the ground and stamped it into the red Georgia clay with their feet, effectively silencing the voice of the Cherokee nation. Then the leader and the Guard removed the press, because of course the printing press was a valuable property, and they set fire to the building. So there was this paradox then that his achievements were officially celebrated, but his people, like many other native nations, were herded into the world's first concentration camps and then forced to walk overland from their mid-Atlantic homelands to Oklahoma, thousands of them dying of starvation and exposure and disease along the way. The fact that the Cherokee script survived at all was largely due to Christian publications such as this, which is the Cherokee Bible. And on the one hand, that's a wonderful thing. On the other hand, with the exception of the Reverend Worcester, who actually went to jail to protest the treatment of the Cherokee, the principal role of Christianity in the lives of Native Americans was, of course, to try to pacify and civilize them. So what this tells us about the language, whether written or spoken, of indigenous peoples is that it can very easily be seen by the dominant culture as a threat. And it's a threat in a couple of different ways. First of all, it's a threat in that it gives that culture, that minority culture, that indigenous culture, a sense of unity and identity, or to use a slavery era word, to be uppity, to have dignity and self-respect, in other words. And the other thing is that if you're a member of the dominant culture, when you hear people speaking or see them writing in their traditional language, you don't know what they're saying because, of course, you haven't learned it. You're the dominant one. Why should you have to learn somebody else's alphabet? So for all you know, because you don't know what they're saying or they're writing, they could be making fun of you. They could be planning rebellion. Plus, it's expensive and time-consuming to try to conduct law, medicine, banking, and other kinds of administration in multiple languages and to print everything out in multiple scripts. So why bother? Why go to all that bother? Now, in theory, this whole matter of indigenous writing systems has been addressed, and it's been addressed by no less a body than the United Nations. And so here is the Article 13 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize, use, develop, and transmit to future generations their histories, languages, oral traditions, philosophies, writing systems, and literatures, and to designate and retain their own names for communities, places, and persons. And I have to say, if there is one nation in the world that is following that article in every respect, I, for one, would like to hear about it. So the Cherokee script and the Cherokee experience then strike me as being a great way to start this series, because it really highlights for me some assumptions that we as a dominant culture make, not only about minority cultures or indigenous cultures, but also about writing. And those assumptions limit our understanding of the way writing works. They limit the way we think about our transactions in writing with each other and with other cultures. And if I have my way, then in this series, I'm going to try and do something about that. At the end of my talks, normally I make a pitch for financial support for this Zoom series. But this time I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to say, if you want to send us a bunch of money, that'd be great right now. But I would actually prefer it if you would hold on for just a couple of weeks, because early November, we are starting a Kickstarter campaign, our most ambitious yet, to play an active part in protecting, supporting, and promoting the Mongolian language and writing system, which, if you follow the news, is currently under serious threat. So we'll be, believe me, we'll be telling you about that Kickstarter campaign when it comes up. But that is going to be a massive endeavor on our part. We're going to be trying to create a whole series of products and activities to promote awareness. And we are absolutely going to need your support. Okay, so with that said, I would love to throw this session open for questions. Alec has got some, if you've put them in chat, that he can read to me, or you can use the function on Zoom, which allows you to put your hand up, and I will do my best to answer them. And if I can't answer them, I will sidestep it and I will answer a different question that I actually do know the answer to. Okay, go ahead.
There are no questions yet, but there are a couple of interesting comments at the end of the chat about other alphabetic impositions.
Okay, let's have a look at those. Okay, Ken Lundy, who's not only helpful but extraordinarily knowledgeable, has put some useful links. Okay, so the same way the French imposed the Latin alphabet on Vietnam. So I've actually heard two different versions of the story. So one of the scripts, actually that is behind me, but it's hiding behind the Cherokee carving, that is definitely one of the endangered alphabets, is Chunam, which is a version of the Chinese script that was used by the Vietnamese to write Vietnamese for 1,000 years. And when the French arrived and when Christian missionaries arrived, they almost certainly played a role in propagating the Latin alphabet. But interestingly enough, young Vietnamese intellectuals early in the 20th century began to look on Chu Nom not as their ancestral script, precisely because it was so Chinese derived. And they wanted, in a spirit of kind of nationalism and sort of identity development, to start using a script that was not sort of reminiscent of the Chinese influence over their culture. And they might have created their own writing system. If they had had a Vietnamese writing system that predated Chunom, they might have used that. As it was, they chose the Latin alphabet because it struck them as being modern and as a means of connecting them to a modern world that was not Chinese. So the story about the use of Latin alphabet in Vietnam is actually pretty complicated. It's different than it is in a number of other places. Okay, another question. The Soviet Union imposed Cyrillic script on practically every minority language that fell under Russian/Soviet ownership. Yes, absolutely. And of course, the great irony there is that the Cyrillic script became emblematic, especially to the West, of godless communism. But it's actually the script of the Greek Orthodox Church, and was imported into Eastern Europe and then into Russia by Orthodox missionaries. I've often wondered to what extent the commissars who made the decision that Cyrillic script should represent the Soviet Union were aware of or cared about its extraordinarily deep roots. I mean, its thousand-year-old roots in Eastern Christianity.
We have a hand up from Antonia.
Okay. Yes, go ahead. You may need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying to do that. Hi.
Hey.
Thank you very much for this. I was wondering, do we know whether there was any discussion? So when the script was being developed, do we know whether there was any discussion whether they should go for an alphabet or a syllabary, and what kind of syllabary, and what in the end made them decide, or made Sequoia to decide to go for the kind of syllabary he went for?
Great question. And it's a question also that indicates another hole in the Morgan-Tyler argument, because the Morgan-Tyler argument saw syllabaries as being less advanced and sophisticated than true alphabets. In a number of cultures around the world, and you'll see this in particular in Southeast Asia, but also in North America, you have languages that are much more clearly and heavily syllabic than, for example, Northern European languages. And the contrast I like to draw is between the word strengths, which is a monosyllabic English word that has 8 letters, only 1 syllable. You know, it's about as syllabic and unmusical as a word can possibly be. And on the other hand, you have the Sri Lankan cricket team. So the great thing about the Sri Lankan cricket team is when you recite their names, they are so obviously syllabic and rhythmic, like Jayasuriya and Kalawitanara and Samarawira. You know, it really demonstrates that these are languages which are beautifully ready for syllabic analysis or segmentation.
So you mean open syllables rather than closed? Because I mean, English is just as syllabic. It's just that if you've got nths at the end of a syllable, that's not really easy to write with a syllabary. So.
Exactly. Yes, so that's the consonant vowel, consonant vowel, consonant vowel combination. And of course, many, possibly most, I'm not sure, North American native languages are also very syllabic, as you see in the place names that in fact are derived from the languages. So my understanding is that Sequoia went through a number of variations and attempts and developments. And in fact, the story that is told even by the Cherokee about him is that he was so committed to his work that his wife set fire to his cabin with him in it, therefore potentially becoming the world's first alphabet widow. Whether it was to destroy him or all the pieces of bark and paper and materials that he'd been working on, we don't know. But certainly when it emerged and it was demonstrated to the tribal council, who by the way came up with this great test, which I'll explain in a minute. It was a syllabary, and as far as we know, they didn't try and make it anything other than a syllabary. The principal transition it went through, in fact, was that when the Reverend Worcester created a typeface for it, it made this transition to something that was much more type-friendly and European in appearance. Many of the letters, in fact, look like Latin alphabet letters, and they have serifs, often in very curious places, in an effort to make the whole thing more type-friendly and more European-friendly. The test that the tribal council came up with was like, how do we know that you're not just writing rubbish, and then claiming that it says something? And luckily, Sequoia had taught the syllabary to his daughter, Ioka. Again, very syllabic name.
Yeah.
And so what they did, and again, this is genius at work, given that these ideas are so new. They separated the two of them and they gave each of them dictation and said, write this down and we'll see whether the other person can read it, which is like lateral thinking, Edward de Bono puzzles, like right there. How would you test that? And who knows what would have happened if Sequoia hadn't actually taught it anybody else. But there you go. So he and his daughter convinced the tribal council, and the tribal council, to their great credit, realized that all of their traditions were going to be set aside for this extraordinary leap, a leap of language, a leap of faith, and they were going to teach it. I don't know if that answers your question, but it certainly answers questions that I knew how to answer.
No, you did answer that. Especially, I think the key was when you talked about the syllabic structure of the language. If it's of open syllables, then you're absolutely right. It's predestined for a syllabary. And just so my own background is as a classicist, and for example, the ancient Greeks, they used a syllabic script which they sort of inherited originally through the Phoenicians.
Yeah.
Their language was absolutely not suitable for a syllabic script, and so they had to find all these workarounds, and it took them centuries to come up with the idea of developing an alphabet. And so this kind of development that you described, that you have someone with such linguistic understanding to then say, okay, my language works like this. This is the best way of putting it into written signs. That's brilliant.
It's extraordinary. The other thing that happened with the Greeks, and maybe you know how this happened, but as far as I know, nobody knows how it happened, is that they took the Phoenician symbols and turned them through 90 degrees. And that is so counterintuitive to us, because we're used to writing being, well, first of all, we're used to our writing surfaces being level, horizontal, etc. We're used to writing being very, very sort of linear, organized, all this kind of stuff. It's very hard for us to think outside that particular box. But one of the great things about the Endangered Alphabets project is that it's taken me outside the box to look back inside. And so, for example, there are scripts that were written lying propped on your left elbow on the sand. And if you're doing that, it's very hard to write in straight lines because your elbow hits into your side. So you kind of write diagonally away from you. And then there are scripts that were largely written on rough or vertical surfaces. There are scripts that were carved into bamboo tubes, which it's very dangerous to actually carve in bamboo, which is like a curved and kind of hard, slick surface. And so they were written with the bamboo pole away at arm's length, and the foot of it tucked between your feet. just because otherwise, you could slice your veins
Yeah,
open.
yeah.
So the whole process of directionality, if you like, the topography. Oh, this is a great word. I must use this again. The topography of writing is a subject that almost nobody thinks about, and yet it has been sort of fundamental to the evolution, a word I use very carefully, of writing as we know it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'll just say one thing to that,
Yes,
because then I'll stop, monopolizing the conversation. I think one thing that we know about, the direction of writing is you used to have sort of larger tablets, sort of clay tablets, that you would hold on your hand like this, and then you'd write. And then the large majority of tablets that we have from the earliest Greek writing, Linear B, which is sort of 13th century BC, are actually tablets that that are sort of like this, and you hold them in your hand. And you don't have a big tablet that's bigger than your hand, but you've got something that fits right into your palm. And I don't know about other people, but for me, holding my hand like this and then sort of writing on it seems a lot more natural than this. And so one reason why there may have been a change, sort of, why characters may have been turned by 90 degrees, might have been exactly because of this change in, just simple format of the clay thing that they wrote on.
I love that. You have just earned a refund of your fee, your admission fee for today's talk. That's a great observation. Okay, so question, do you have any plans to work with Southeast Asian indigenous languages?
Quick question. Somebody wants to know if this is the same Antonia who produced the introduction to Sanskrit. She's
Did I see a nod?
Yes, that's me.
Brilliant.
I don't know who asked this, but hello. I'm flattered.
So this is fabulous. This is like a celebrity panel. This isn't just a bunch of people who walked in off the street here. And this also goes to prove, by the way, that as usual, I actually know less than anybody else who's sitting in. And so I mostly do these actually to learn things that I don't know. Okay, so thank you. Do I have any plans to work with Southeast Asian indigenous languages, especially from Bangladesh in the future? So yes, I've done a lot of work with indigenous Bangladesh scripts. And in fact, some of them you can see behind me. And I have partnered up with my friend Mong New from the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh. And we've created mother language educational materials for a small number of schools that actually teach in the indigenous languages and scripts in the hill tracts of Bangladesh, which is a very polylinguistic region. Also in Southeast Asia and further east, one of the talks, in fact, I think the next talk is going to be about Balinese. So yes, I absolutely love that whole region, which has a series of linguistic histories that, again, show a different way of thinking about writing that when I first started to stumble into this completely blew my mind. And I'm going to talk about that next time rather than prefigure it now.
There was a question right before that.
Yes, go ahead.
I wonder how people should feel about a script being invented by a foreigner.
So I'm going to answer a slightly different question, not because I can't answer that question, but because there's something that is at the heart of the Endangered Alphabets project that I want to kind of lay out. So when I started this process of doing these carvings and then giving talks and all this kind of thing, I have to tell you, I felt not only ignorant, as we've already demonstrated, but also really presumptuous and in great danger of blundering into ethical and linguistic areas that I knew nothing about and doing more harm than good. And so when I started hearing back from people who are from the language cultures in which I had done carvings, there was a certain trepidation. And what happened was, and I received this kind of feedback, I would say dozens of times in almost exactly the same words. And that was, thank you for showing our beautiful script. So there's several things about that statement that are really interesting. First of all, the thank you is often because many of these cultures are marginalized even within their own country by their own neighbors. And so for somebody beyond that horizon to recognize them and to show an interest in them in a respectful way was a huge change and a welcome change. And then secondly, I want to look at the word beautiful. So one of the limitations of our using the Latin alphabet is that because it's so widely used and it's used for so many purposes, it's become so utilitarian that we no longer even notice it. And we don't really take pride in it because it's like everywhere. You know, would you take pride in dirt? You know, the dirt is everywhere. And so these are people, this was the first real illumination I had, that the depth of meaning of the script to the people who used it was profound beyond words. And that's when I really started saying to myself, okay, why is writing so important? And why is it especially important to the people who use this particular form of writing? And that turned out to be a much more complicated and profound question than I realized. And again, it's one that most people are not thinking about. And two, you only start thinking about when you get outside the box and you're out in among the endangered alphabets and you can look back from their point of view. Alec, how are we doing? We got any more questions?
No questions, but interesting note about modification of the Cherokee script by Reverend Worcester was to save money in the commissioning of the type founding by reusing Latin type punches.
Huh. Nice. Same cost pressure cause simplification. Index scripts when cast in type by 19th century British civil servants. Plus, of course, it was, to the British, it would have been much more recognizable. And I wonder, so thank you for that observation. I wonder also whether there is this notion, because this turns up time and time again, of what writing should look like. So one of the things that happens with indigenously created scripts in a number of African countries is that there is a widespread assumption, especially among intellectuals, especially amongst the power elite, that indigenous languages and even more indigenous writing systems are incapable of expressing sophisticated thought. And therefore, it's right that the kids should be learning French, for example, because that is a language and a script that has demonstrated the ability to be used for the highest intellectual purposes. Now, of course, this is a circular argument, because if you never try and use an indigenously created script for intellectual purposes to express abstract ideas, then of course it remains as a largely, for example, agricultural script. And Cherokee, interestingly enough, faces a similar issue. So one of the things that's happening right now in the Cherokee communities is that they're recognizing that the Cherokee language that survived in Cherokee homes, despite being marginalized, despite kids being punished if they spoke it in schools, all this kind of stuff. It sort of got suspended in time as a mid-19th century agrarian language. And if the need to express more modern concepts or label more modern objects arose, then the temptation was to use English. But then that's because you're in the belly of the beast, right? You're surrounded by the imperialists. So the Cherokee have language committees, and they think about how they want to address updating their language. Do they want to use an English word? Do they want to look at the Latin roots of that English word and then use those semantic stepping stones to create a similar Cherokee word from the same roots? So for example, clouds. So the Cherokee language does not have, or did not have, the same words and the same range of words for meteorology. They had their own set of words for meteorology. So if you want to say a cumulus cloud, for example, what are you going to do? Are you going to use the English word? Are you going to use the Latin root, because cumulus means a pile or a heap? So are you going to just use the Cherokee word for heap for that? Or are you going to come up with an entirely different Cherokee word that expresses what this cloud looks like to you? And I know that they've debated this for computer, for example. You know, what word should we use for computer? And the thing that I especially love about this is that instead of this being handled by, you know, kind of the Académie Française or the equivalent in Cherokee society, this is ordinary people who are getting together and talking this stuff out. And then the Eastern Cherokee and the Western Cherokee sort of try things out, and then they meet up and say, how are you doing? You know, what are you using for this? And it's an extraordinarily democratic process of language development. Okay, I think we have time for maybe one more question.
There's one question about if you know of any indigenous languages that are bidirectional, indigenous alphabets.
Oh, bidirectional. So, okay. One of the great advantages to my old way of doing these Zooms is that I could actually run off and pick up a carving and bring it back and hold it up, or I could take my phone with the camera and go and there's a carving that I've done that I would love to show you, but it's in a box in the garage because I'm moving soon. So there are a number of symbol systems. Purists say that they're not writing, but they are ways of conveying meaning and conveying ideas through creating symbols that are used on fabrics or in carvings or whatever, in West Africa in particular. And because they are they strike us as being more pictorial than linear, it means that you're not limited to reading them in any one way. Excuse me. So they become multidimensional, like a painting, in fact, which, you know, your eye can track around it. And depending on the sequence of eye movements, you might actually derive different kinds of meaning. So it's kind of really rich and complex in terms of not only the meanings that it can convey, but the ways in which those meanings can be interpreted. So the Nsibidi symbol system, the Adinkra symbol system, there is a system that was developed in Africa and then really developed much further in Cuba, called firmas. Excuse me. And all of these are much more cosmographic in a way. And again, the kind of the purist possibly would say, oh, that's not writing. But, you know, when you're out there in the territory of the endangered alphabets, you're sort of going, no, it's better. It does more things. It does different things. It does more radical things. It does things that we can't do with writing. So again, that answers a question which is sufficiently similar to your question for me to feel I've done a decent job. And with that, I'm going to bid you adieu, or adieu, as they say. You'll get the email with the link to the recording of this session, and also a link to the registration for the next session. I am so glad to have had you here and had your comments. And as always, I've probably learned more than you have. Do come back, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks.